Good morning, church family. It is such a joy to be in the house of the Lord with you all today. This is not only the Lord's house, it's also my house. I grew up here, I was raised here. Not only did I graduate from Little Tree Preschool, I think you can see a picture of that up there. But after I graduated and I went to the elementary school across the street, after school, many of my peers would either go home or go to daycare, but I would come back to the church and hang out in Miss Jones' office, the secretary's office, where she'd have a bin of pretzels hidden away for me to snack on. I don't know if any of you remember feeling confused on January 27th of 2011, when at 10 in the morning, the church bells rang 13 times. I was celebrating my 13th birthday in the steeple of the church. I've had so many meals in this back room over here, meals of leftover communion bread. Don't tell the deacons. But this church has been more than a location. It's been my family. Ida and Ken Ruck used to drive me to violin lessons. Al and Jenny Check would take my sister and I out to the movies, which would inevitably culminate in a popcorn fight with Al. Mrs. Collins and Mrs. Daly came to my high school awards night with a bottle of champagne, the non-alcoholic kind. Anne Marie Weideman would make meals for my family when my mom was out of town. Kathy Jager drove me to my first retreat. Everything I know about faith and community and what it looks like to live out the love of God, I learned here. And because of this legacy, I am who I am today. I continue to work in ministry because of the vision this church congregation set out for me. And so I can personally testify to the importance of what we are going to be talking about today, inheritance. When I first think about inheritance, I think about all of the things we inherit from our families, like they were talking about during the children's message. I think about things we inherit through wills, things we inherit through the way that we're raised, things we inherit through DNA. We might inherit grandpa's smile or grandma's nose, an uncle's sense of humor, an aunt's athletic ability. We inherit money, we inherit property. But we also inherit negative things. We inherit debt, genetic illness, trauma, and abuse. Some of the things we inherit, we want to treasure and grow and pass on to future generations. Other things we inherit, we want to mitigate and make smaller so other people won't have to deal with it eventually. Inheritance is complex. And when we bring the concept outside of just what we inherit from our families to include those things we inherit from our faith communities, things we inherit from society at large, it only gets more complicated and nuanced. The Bible has a lot to say about inheritance, from Old Testament prophets and Proverbs and Psalms all the way through to the New Testament Gospels and the letters of Paul. We hear about inheritance over and over. In Psalm 2, verse 8, we read, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." Proverbs 13, verse 22, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." Matthew 5, verse 5, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Galatians 3, verse 29, "And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." It comes up over and over again. And over the next few weeks, you will be exploring what some of these verses mean, what it means to inherit things as a people of God, what it means to inherit things from our faith community, and how we respond to our inheritance. But today, to get us started, I wanted to go back even further and think about what are those things all people have inherited from the beginning. So we go back to the beginning, Genesis 1. The Bible opens with this beautiful creation poem. God speaks into existence light. He separates the earth from the waters. He makes the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky vegetation and animals, and it is beautiful and it is good. And then in Genesis 1, verse 26, we read, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Our first inheritance, before everything else, is that of the image of God. What an incredible inheritance. This is the knowledge that each of us are born with creativity and relational capacity. We're born with power and free will. This is our treasure. This is an inheritance we need to live into. We need to pass on knowledge of this to future generations. Here at APC, you already do that so well. The first time I remember being aware that not only am I born in the image of God, but so is everyone else, was sitting on the floor of Crossroads Youth Group, where every week we would be reminded that no matter who you are, or what your parents do, or what clothes you're wearing, or how cool you are, or how rich you are, you belonged. Because we were there to share the love of Jesus, because we are all children of God, and we were all made in his image. But the story doesn't end with the inheritance of God's image. Just 2 chapters later, in Genesis 3, we learn of a second inheritance. In chapter 3 of Genesis, we learn about the first decision made to disobey God. Our second inheritance is the inheritance of sin. And this inheritance, like the inheritance of image, is inescapable and unavoidable. Although it started with one decision so many years ago, that decision reverberates throughout all of our lives. We all inherit sin. As Romans 5, verse 19 puts it, through the disobedience of the one man, the many were made sinners. This is something we cannot escape. And so starting in these first 3 chapters, we learn that we are both blessed, born with the image of God, and we are also sinful, born into brokenness. And this tension, this dual inheritance, is seen over and over again throughout the Bible. The Israelites are brought out of slavery in Egypt, and God says, "I am your God, and you are my people." They are blessed. And in the wilderness, they immediately begin worshiping other gods. They're brought into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, a blessed land. And they immediately forget God and are thrown into exile. Even in the New Testament, we see this tension. The disciples are chosen to follow Jesus, or his right-hand man, blessed by his presence. And yet at the cross, they all abandon him. Over and over again, we see this tension, this dual inheritance. And I think in these stories and also in our own lives, we experience this inheritance as a process. There are times where we're in step with God, walking on the same path as him, and then sin creeps in and our path diverges from his. Maybe you get married, and at first, you and your spouse are deeply in love with one another. You're walking side by side as partners, just as God intended the harmony of marriage to be. And then over time, you get busy, and other things take priority above that relationship. And you stop noticing your spouse. And one day, you wake up, and the person lying next to you has been deeply unhappy for many years, and you didn't even notice. Or maybe you start a new job, and it's a career and a job that God has called you to. And you feel so excited to share the love of God with your coworkers. You feel like God has placed you in this specific spot. And then over time, you get a promotion, a higher paycheck, and that feels pretty good. And the allures of power and money make you forget why you originally took the job. And you wake up one day in a joyless job, without a sense of God's presence, failing to be his ambassador to your work culture, and you realize you've lost all sense of purpose. I see this process play out in my own life over and over again. There are times where I feel like I have a close relationship with God, and out of that relationship comes a genuine desire to love all of the people around me. And then someone I admire, someone with some influence, compliments me. They invite me to come and hang out with their friends. And boy, it's exciting to be on the in crowd. And in order to cement my place there, to prove that I belong, I begin to gossip about other people behind their backs. And I wake up one day and look in the mirror, and I can't see the image of God anywhere. I feel disgusted because all of a sudden I've become a mere sinner. If we're being honest, I think we all know this path from image bearer into sin. But the good news is that this process is not linear. It's a cycle. Just as there is a way that we fall from God's image into sin, there is some miraculous transformation only possible through the goodness of God that brings us back into image-bearing form. The author Frederick Buechner puts it this way: the news of the gospel is that extraordinary things happen. Zacchaeus climbs up a sycamore tree a crook and climbs down a saint. Paul sets out a hatchet man for the Pharisees and comes back a fool for Christ. It is impossible for anybody to leave behind the darkness of the world he carries on his back like a snail. But for God, all things are possible. On those days when we wake up grieving the tragedy of sin in our lives, there is hope. There is a way back to image bearing. There is a way to complete the cycle. And this is the tension of the dual inheritance. While sin is inevitable, God has set out to bring us back to him over and over and over. One of the people in my life who best represents this tension is my grandpa. My grandpa was born in a low-income community. He was born to an alcoholic father and an abusive mother. Everything in his background suggested that he would live a life of poverty and grief and addiction and despair. And yet he was also born in the image of God. And my grandpa was able to leverage his unique giftings to obtain an education, a career, to become a father and a husband. He had some really wonderful giftings. He was truly born in the image of God. And yet he could also be a very difficult person. You see, my grandpa was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He could be disruptive, he could demand attention. At my parents' wedding, he brought a police whistle that he was shrilling so loudly they couldn't hear the DJ or people giving speeches. He would make irrational decisions, and when anyone challenged him, he would turn cruel. Then he would go through seasons of depression where he would sit in dark rooms by himself. My grandpa had demons. He could go from being the greatest blessing to the greatest burden for his family, depending on the consistency of his medication. And yet, through the grace of God, the love of my grandma, the patience of his family, my grandpa completed the cycle every time. He came back to being an image bearer. My grandpa was full of the brokenness of this world, but he was also full of the image of God. Wherever you are in this cycle between image bearing and sin this morning, I want to encourage you to consider two possible responses to our inheritance. Our first response is to decide where we want to focus our attention. This is a complex, complicated cycle full of different angles and nuances. And so we have to decide, where are we going to expend our energy? When we choose to focus on the problem of sin, we end up falling into the blame game. We ask questions like, where is God in this? How could you do that to me? What have I done? This blame game has been played since Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve blame each other and the serpent when questioned about their decision. And yet we also learn from that story that blame doesn't bring about healing. When I was in middle school, I read a book called Touching Spirit Bear. In this book, an angry teenager goes to one of his elders for some advice on how to deal with his anger. The elder holds up a stick, and he says, the left half of this stick represents your anger. Break it off. And so the boy breaks off the left half of the stick and hands the remaining piece back to the elder. He looks at it and says, there's still a left half of this stick. And so the boy breaks it off again and again before finally admitting there will always be a left half of the stick. The elder says, exactly. Your anger is always going to be there. The question is that where you're going to focus your attention? I think the same thing is true of this cycle. Sin and brokenness will always be a part of our lives. But the question is, have we taken stock of the right half of the stick? Have we lived into the great grace and hope of redemption that we are offered? Because when we choose to focus on this possibility of renewal and change, our lives are transformed. When we wake up next to our unhappy spouse, what would it look like to, instead of taking stock of past grievances, to instead just be grateful that they're still there? We get a chance to be a better partner today. When we wake up in a joyless job without a sense of God's presence, what does it look like to show up in our work culture as an image bearer? To remind other people that they too bear God's image, and to transform our work culture through the love of God. On those days when I recognize I have wielded in-groups and out-groups to the detriment of others, what does it look like to return to humility and to widen my circle so that there's room for everyone at my table? Our first response to the inheritance of sin and of image is to decide where we're going to focus our attention, and to focus our attention on the hope of redemption. Our second response centers around the fact that it is impossible to return to God's image alone. It is for this reason that in Matthew chapter 18, verse 20, Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there among them. Jesus recognizes the importance of community. Community helps us think through our inheritance and decide how we want to respond. They help to name our brokenness, but they also remind us that our first identity is that of an image bearer. Not only that, in community, we come to recognize that other people bear God's image too. And out of that knowledge, we respond with a desire to love and to forgive and to care for others. And in turn, we become part of bringing other people back to image bearing as well. When we live in honest community with each other, we are far more likely to recognize our inheritance and to respond in healthy ways. I find these two responses helpful when I think about my grandfather today. I don't focus on his challenges, but instead I remember how he used to call me to him to give me a top kiss, a kiss on the top of the head. How he would shout, "Encore, encore," after even the squeakiest violin performance. I remember how, despite the demands of his career, he would bring his family to church every Sunday, so that one day my dad would sense a call into ministry, and one day I would be raised in the same faith with the same convictions. I remember how my grandpa passed on an inheritance of image-bearing faith. And when I remember him, I do so surrounded by a community of people who recognize his complexities and love him all the same. My hope this morning is that we offer each other that same grace when we think about ourselves. That we remember that our first identity is that of an image bearer. That we focus our energies on returning to bearing God's image. And that on this journey, we surround ourselves with a community of people moving in that same direction. We have all inherited both sin and image. My prayer this morning is that we choose to live into the image of God. Amen.